So we're going to look at the verse. It says, you are responsible for your souls. You are responsible for yourselves. Obviously, that doesn't entail that you are not responsible for other people around you. Islam commands you. You are responsible for your family members. You are responsible for your friends. You are responsible for people in your community, right? But you have a primary responsibility to yourself. Now, what is the person? Who is the person? What is it that makes me me? What is it that differentiates me? For example, when we see, ajallakumullah, we see like animals out and about, or we hear narrations about angels. You know the famous narration that says that humans, and obviously the jinn, they were created with rationale, and they were also created, with the nafs, like they want things, they feel. Angels were created with intellect, where they don't feel, and their duty is just to service Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's what they do. And then you have obviously the animals. They have no intellect, they have no rationality, but they are animals, they feel, they live, and they die. And we are different than that. So we start with ourselves. What is the human being? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we can all confirm this easily by just, observing our own lives. We have different faculties that exist within us. One of the main faculties that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us, like we said, it's the nafs. The nafs, it's what Allah instilled in the human being to want. The nafs wants, it's what you need. You need the nafs to survive. You need it to eat, to drink, to live, to want to start a family, to be around people, to feel emotions. The nafs is an integral part of the human being, right? It's tied to the body, tied to the self of the human. And then contrasting that, you have obviously the intellect. This faculty that you have where you can process information and make good decisions and differentiate between right and wrong. This intellect, Allah, like if we look at the narrations, there's a plethora of narrations that talk about the importance of the intellect and how great of an asset it is to the human being. And it is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will use to test the human being and to judge him, because there is no excuse. What is the intellect? We start. The intellect can do two things. There's two different, if you want to classify it. One, the intellect, the mind, the person is able to differentiate right and wrong. No one's going to come and tell me, a serious person that actually lives life like normal people, and say oppression is good, or that helping people is bad, right? Or that lying is good, or that stealing is good, or that being truthful is bad. There are things that the human and all humans, all normal humans, can look at and say, yeah, I can judge, make a judgment on this and say this is good, this is bad. Another thing you're able to do with the intellect is you're able to process information. You're able to make deductions. And we do that every single day. For example, the law of cause and effect. Someone just walked in, for example. I know that they had to come from somewhere. Or I see that all humans are born at one point. So then I say, and no human, for example, lives forever. So I can say, for example, I make a judgment and say, all humans die. So we're able to make all these judgments with the intellect. But we said there's the intellect, there's the nafs. Now there's other faculties that exist within the human. We're all able to process information. We have our senses, right? We can see, feel, touch, all of these formulate images in our brains. We're able to then what? And by the way, we're highlighting all these faculties because these all affect us in our day-to-day lives, and when we go through problems in life, to balance these out with one another and understand what's affecting us helps us balance our lives. So we're just going to talk about these for a bit to then be able to get to what we're trying to focus on. So then the human, for example, has the ability to imagine. You take an image right now. I'll have all of you sitting in front of me. I close my eyes, all of you are in my head. But we're able to construct images with our imagination. So that's another faculty. Another thing is emotion. Emotion is a really big one. Right? Or when we want, like we said, the faculties of the nafs. So how do we deal with all of these things? Can some of these faculties come and override and overpower other faculties? If we said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us the intellect to be able to balance, are we using the intellect correctly? Do we understand what it is to then be able to not let our emotions or not let our wants, our nafs overpower us? We're going to get into that after Allah salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And to talk about these things is to then understand truly who Sayyidah Fatima was. Because she was a human like us. Right? We've heard the phrase, like I said earlier, that she's infallible, or that the Prophet was infallible, or that the Ma'sumeen, the rest of the Imams and the Prophets are infallible. But what does infallibility mean? Some of us might have an incorrect preconceived notion that infallibility means that God created this human being that is perfect from the day he was born. He didn't have to worry about anything, and all he had to do was deliver the message, and he dealt with what he dealt with. And we think and we live, and we're the ones that have to deal with our tests, our trials, our tribulations, sinning against God, focusing on trying to do what's good. Some of us have that mindset, and that's incorrect. That's not what infallibility is. This world, as we all know, this world is a test. God put us on this earth, and we make actions. We have the ability to choose what we want to do and what we don't want to do in most cases, right? We can't just fly on command or do some activities that the human is not able to do. We're limited in certain areas. But in the actions we're able to make decisions in, we have that free will. And the prophets and the imams are just like you. Except that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we see this every single day in our lives, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created people with different capabilities. Some people are very bright intellectually. Some people are very good with their hands. Some people are very artistic. Some people are just, a lot naturally more empathetic. We have different capabilities. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we know also the verse that Allah does not burden a soul with which it cannot bear. And prophethood and imama and being a representative of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on earth is one of the mightiest of tests and positions, and it is a necessity that humans need, or human societies need, in order to thrive and survive. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to choose someone who has the capabilities to do it. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't get tested. Nabi Muhammad's life, his entire life, the life of all the imams, all of it was a test after test after test. And when we commemorate all the commemorations and the martyrdoms of the imams and the Prophet, we see the things that they went through, and we cry every year. These are very heavy burdens. There are narrations that say where the Prophet is specific. He's saying, no prophet has been burdened and hurt more than I have. And so they still reacted. The prophets felt grief. We look, the Quran is filled with examples of prophets feeling grief, crying, lamenting loss, and all these things. And they feel and they live just like one of us. Except that infallibility means that when the prophet or when the infallible, the imam, is delivering the message, or he's ensuring that the people are receiving the message from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or he's acting upon what the message wants, he's not going to make a mistake. Why? Because if he were to make a mistake, one, how do I know that this is the true action? So Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi comes and tells me, pray. And I know he's the prophet, and he came with the miracle, he came with the Quran and other miracles that he came with at the time. He tells me to pray. So I pray. And then I look, and then he tells me, let's say I pray behind him, and then he tells me, oh, I made a mistake in prayer. Or you get to a point where you're able to ascertain that you don't know where he made a mistake or he didn't. So then it's like, well, if the prophet is making mistakes, how am I first of all supposed to know exactly how to do it? A second one is that people, when we said the nafs comes and it overpowers, and when we look at the story of the prophets and the imams, the nafs, when it dominates a person, it starts not even wanting to adhere to the truth. The verse, what does one of the verses in the Quran say? وَجَحَدُوا بِهَا وَاسْتَيْقَنَتْهَا أَنفُسَهُمْ. Juhud, the word juhud in Arabic, what the translation of the verse, it's they saw the truth, they accepted it, they knew what it was, right? وَاسْتَيْقَنَتْهَا أَنفُسَهُمْ, right? And they still chose to reject it. So the nafs comes and it overpowers. And so the prophet, if he were to make mistakes, if he were to lie, if he were to not be accurate when he's relaying the teachings, people are going to be like, why would I follow the person that's not upholding the sharia? If he's literally coming and he's representing God, and he wants us to pray, and he wants us to fast, and he wants us to do all these things, and he's doing them wrong, or he's not even doing them, why should I do them? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala aids the prophet, aids the imam with knowledge, right? So the prophet with revelation, the imams with knowledge. And there's this thing that narrations point to, it's called Ruh al-Qudus. It's this creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where narrations say it even comes and it aids the believer, and it keeps them steadfast to the religion. Once again, why? Because they are carrying out this message. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us. He didn't create us as prophets. He didn't create us as, He didn't choose us to be a prophet or an imam or an infallible, right? We're regular people, and we have to abide by this message. So they get this knowledge, that is, they are able to use this knowledge right? To not commit a sin. That's what it is. The infallible, it's not that he does never do a sin, it's that he chooses not to do a sin. And that's the fine point. That's the detail. That's what it means to be an infallible. And you guys right now, I can say to each one of you, you guys have infallibility in certain things. Because what does infallibility mean? It means that you're not doing the thing. You are protected, you are not doing the thing. For example, I can say that people in the crowd are ma'sumin, they're infallible from drinking alcohol. And what is the cause of this infallibility? We look at our societal norms. Things like, for example, eating haram food, eating pork, drinking alcohol are so frowned upon in our cultures that the absolute majority of us, even when we think about these things, we feel disgusted. Right? And we can think of a lot of things in our lives that are haram, that our nafs, our taste, when we hear about these sins, we get disgusted. And so the ma'soom, it's the same way. It's just they have knowledge in certain things where when they look at the sin, they're not going to do it. And we can reach points where if we tie ourselves to our religion, if we keep learning about the religion, we can avoid a lot of the things. So that's a very clarifying point. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Now, as a human being, I go through various things in life. Various trials, various tests. Sometimes I make an incorrect judgment. For example, I feel like someone wronged me. I think he wronged me. In reality, though, he didn't wrong me or she didn't wrong me. But I feel like they did. And I keep making that deduction that they did. And then that leads to negative emotion. And then I either feel depressed about it or angry, right? And the next thing I know, and instead of trying and striving to make sure that this anger or this judgment that I made is correct, I just let the emotion, I just let the negative reactions consume me. Or for example, when someone loses a loved one, the grief becomes so strong, you see them, they don't want to cater towards their responsibilities. Eating feels like a chore. Going out of the house feels like a chore. They don't want to talk to people. They don't want to look at people. The grief is heavy, and we can feel grief to various reasons. It doesn't have to be losing a loved one. Anything. Losing a job, not doing good in school, losing friends. All these things are things that come and it can cause us grief. If we use, though, our intellects correctly, and we have to, like, that's what it comes down to. We have to be like real. We have to be a part of reality. We can't let, for example, just emotion control us. We can't let there's another one that I forgot to add. Sometimes the grief or these things where people go through these experiences that make them want to seclude themselves, they end up trying to relive those moments with what? Reliving these moments. They go into the world of imagination. That's why we talked about it in the beginning. So either feel, and then that causes also emotion. So it's like this big complex circle where if the human is not aligning himself correctly and not trying to understand who he is, it's a vicious cycle that can be repetitive and it has to be broken. And it can be broken through various ways. One is being around people that care for you, that try to help you out, that call out your actions that are not right. Another one is, and this is the important one, is utilizing our intellects correctly. And so that means we have to be able to train our minds to be able to figure out what's correct and not correct. And then also be able to make sure that we're asking people to make sure that the things that we think are correct are correct. And that's very important because that is the start. Keeping or setting the foundations of understanding how we operate as humans is how then we can go about to having this strong identity in our religion. In really commemorating who Sayyidah Fatima was. Because it starts from there. Because with this faculty of intellect, we're then able to prove God. We're able to prove prophethood. We're able to prove that Nabi Muhammad was the final prophet and that the other prophets were prophets. Right? We're able to prove that the Quran is the book of God. All through the intellect. And then there's obviously then what the prophet comes with. Right? And the miracles that the prophet comes with, then he can prove to the people that he is actually a representative of God. But without our intellects, we are not able to get to the point where we can accept what the prophet is saying. Right? So that is the intellect. And we have to make sure that we are using it correctly. And we cannot let these other faculties consume us. Because, for example, I see myself or I see a friend or I see a relative, they're grieving immensely. The time for salah happens. Or fasting. Or for example, having to do something that's wajib. And they don't feel like it. This person is not in a state of psychosis. If someone goes, for example, to a state of psychosis, or it's a manic episode where they're not in the right minds, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not going to judge them for whatever reason. Someone ends up getting a disorder or whatever. God doesn't judge that person. But if you are rational, even if you're feeling grief, like everyone's heard of the story of Nabi Yaqub. Everyone's probably watched the musalsala of Nabi Yusuf when they were younger. Nabi Yusuf gets taken from his dad, and he had an insanely good relationship with his dad. His dad loved him. And he's gone for years. Nabi Yaqub, a prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he knows his son's alive and he can't see him, and his grief was so strong that they say his eyes went blind from grief, from crying. But is someone like Nabi Yaqub, like grief is a normal part of the human process, but is someone like Nabi Yaqub going to let this emotion not let him act upon his religious obligation? Of course not. So that's the same problem. That's what I'm trying to point out. Your grief or your negative emotion, or you not knowing your responsibilities, or you not adhering to your intellect when it tells you you should be a good person, you should be responsible, you should try to figure out what the truth is. And then, for example, it's time for prayer and I don't feel like praying. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to judge you for that. First of all, let's not even talk, for example, that prayer is one of the reasons that can help you get over that, because it ties you to reality. At the end of the day, who's going to help you get out of your situation other than God? How many situations do we go through in life where if we actually think about death and we think about how God put us on earth for a limited time and the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's really meaningless and we can actually get over it. A route to that is prayer. So I'm going through this very difficult emotional state, or I'm just secluding myself from reality, from society, and I have to pray and I don't feel like it. I'm going to be judged for that. So that's dangerous, because on the day of judgment you have no excuse. Now this is assuming we're all talking to fellow believers. We believe in God, we believe in Islam. If we don't believe in these things, or we have shaky foundations in these things, it needs to be addressed, and that's a conversation for another time. And after the lecture, I'm here to help anyone out with that if they want to talk about that. But we're talking to believers. There's no excuse on the day of judgment. You're going to be asked. We said the verse goes and it says, Allah will show you all that you have done. Oh, you didn't pray. Why? I was going through something. Okay, who said that by you not praying, you wouldn't have gotten over it, or your blessings wouldn't have come? So I can't let what I think or how I feel dictate reality and what is imposed upon me and what I must do. And then this comes down to the other main point. My relationship with my religion, with laws, in light of all this. What is it? Living here in Seattle, it's a smaller community. It's not like, for example, living in the Middle East or a lot of countries where the Muslims are the majority, right? You guys aren't like bigger cities where Muslim communities are very big. It's a smaller community. How is your relationship with your religion? Sometimes you might hear that something is haram. You heard this food is haram, or this action is haram. And you heard it from a sheikh, or you heard it from a friend or something, and you get bothered. And you're like, why would you tell me? Or why is this haram? Why is everything haram? Or you think that the person, for example, obviously as Shia, we go back to scholars, and everyone goes back to scholars to be able to inform of the rulings. We say, why is a marji' that's living in, for example, Najaf, or living in Qom, all the way there, who's not a part of my society, who doesn't know how I live here, and the fact that I had to be a minority in high school and in college and at work, and there's not really a lot of Muslims like me, and he's coming and telling me all the things that I want to do are haram. How does he know what my life is actually like?